It was 3 in the morning, and the city was asleep. But I wasn't. I was staring at the ceiling, the same cracked plaster landscape I'd been mapping out for months. Sleep was a country I no longer had a passport for. My body was a lead weight, pinned to the mattress, but my mind was a frantic storm. It raced through every mistake, every wrong turn, every door that had slammed shut in my face. The silence of the apartment wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. It amplified the sound of my own failure, a ringing in my ears that never seemed to stop. I remember the time when this same apartment felt like a launch pad, a place filled with blueprints for a future I was so sure of. The walls were covered in whiteboards, filled with diagrams and deadlines. Now, they were just blank, staring back at me like ghosts of old ambitions. Primera rolled over the sheets tangled around my legs. The physical discomfort was a dull echo of the chaos inside. I thought about the business I'd poured my soul into, the one that was supposed to be my masterpiece. I'd worked 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning belief that I was building something that mattered. I sacrificed relationships, skipped holidays, and ignored the growing fatigue in my bones. I told myself it would all be worth it, but it wasn't. It had crumbled, not in a spectacular explosion, but in a slow, agonizing decay. One client left, then another. The funding dried up. The market shifted. Every reason was a paper cut, small and insignificant on its own, but together, they left me bleeding out. The final email, the one that confirmed it was all over, didn't even make me angry. I just felt empty. A hollowed-out version of the person I used to be. My friends tried to help at first. They'd call, invite me out. "You need to get out of the house," they'd say. It's not the end of the world, but it felt like it was. My world, the one I had so carefully constructed, had ended, and I didn't know how to explain the chasm that had opened up between their well-meaning advice and my reality. Their words were like pebbles tossed into an abyss. I couldn't even hear them land, so I started ignoring their calls. The texts went unanswered. It was easier to retreat, to build a fortress of solitude around myself. Being alone was painful, but it was less painful than pretending, less painful than seeing the pity in their eyes, the confusion when I couldn't just snap out of it. The isolation became a habit, then a home. The four walls of my apartment were my entire world, and the silence was my only companion. Days blurred into one another, a monotonous loop of gray. I'd wake up late, the sun already high in the sky, a glaring reminder of a world that was moving on without me. I'd shuffle to the kitchen, make coffee I didn't enjoy, and sit at the table where I once planned my future. Now, I just stared out the window at the lives passing by on the street below. People rushing to work, laughing with friends, living. They seemed like actors in a movie I was no longer a part of. Self-doubt was a constant whisper, a venomous narrator in my head. It replayed every failure, every rejection. It told me I was a fraud. It told me I was lazy, worthless, that I'd peaked. This was all that was left. It pointed to the stack of unpaid bills on the counter and sneered. "See, you can't even handle this." The voice was so convincing, so relentless, that I started to believe it. It became my truth. The worst part was the exhaustion. It wasn't just physical tiredness from lack of sleep. It was a soul-deep weariness. It felt like I had been running a marathon for years, and now that I had finally stopped, my body and spirit had just given up. The simplest tasks felt monumental. Taking a shower, making a meal, even just getting dressed. Each action required a negotiation, a battle of wills against the crushing inertia that held me down. I'd stand in front of the open refrigerator, full of food, and feel nothing. No hunger, no desire. It was just another decision I didn't have the energy to make. You lost weight. My clothes hung off me. When I'd catch my reflection in a window, I'd see a stranger. Sunken eyes, pale skin, a haunted look that didn't belong to me. Or maybe it did. Maybe this was who I really was, and the confident, ambitious person from before was the real imposter. I found myself revisiting memories, not the good ones, but the moments of impact, the condescending tone of a potential investor, the disappointment in my parents' voices when I told them things weren't going well, the look on my partner's face when I admitted I couldn't keep my promises anymore. Each memory was a fresh wound. I wasn't just grieving the loss of a dream. I was grieving the loss of the person I thought I was. The person who could handle anything, who always found a way. He was gone. In his place was this fragile, broken shell. I started to wonder if this was it. If this was my new reality. A life lived in the shadows of what could have been. The hope that had once been a blazing fire inside me was now just a pile of cold ash. There was a moment, a particularly dark one. It was another sleepless night. The rain outside matching the gloom inside. I was sitting on the floor, my back against the cold wall, just letting the waves of hopelessness wash over me. For the first time, I didn't even have the energy to fight them. I just let them pull me under. I thought about giving up, not just on my dreams, but on everything. The thought was terrifying, but it was also seductive. It promised an end to the pain, an end to the relentless internal battle. It was a quiet, dark promise of peace. I just sat there, in the dark, letting the idea settle in. I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes from absolute surrender. The weight on my chest didn't disappear, but I stopped trying to push it off. It was the lowest point I had ever known, A silent, solitary rock bottom. The world outside kept spinning, oblivious, but in my small, dark apartment, everything had stopped. There was no past, no future. There was only the crushing, silent weight of the now, and a profound, terrifying stillness. Something shifted in that stillness. Not a revelation, not hope. Just a tiny fracture in the numbness. As I sat there on the floor, staring at nothing, a thought surfaced, quiet, almost embarrassed to exist. If I'm still here, then something hasn't ended yet. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't inspiring. It was simply a fact. My chest still felt heavy. The problems hadn't disappeared. The bills were still unpaid. The future was still a blank, intimidating void. But I was breathing, annoyingly, stubbornly breathing. The storm in my mind hadn't passed, but it had paused, just long enough for me to notice that I was still present, inside my own body. I didn't stand up with purpose. I didn't make a plan. I just pushed myself off the wall and onto the couch, exhausted by the effort. Morning came slowly, gray light leaking through the blinds. For the first time in weeks, I didn't go back to bed. Not because I felt strong, but because lying down felt worse. Staying still felt like sinking. That became the first rule. Not improvement, not success, just don't sink today. Primera. Showered. The water felt foreign against my skin, like I had forgotten what it meant to be warm. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the sound drown out my thoughts. When I got out, I didn't feel better, but I felt awake, and that was new. The days that followed weren't dramatic. They were painfully ordinary. I started waking up at the same time every morning, not because I wanted to, but because chaos had proven it couldn't be trusted. I cleaned the apartment, one room at a time, as if I were clearing debris after a collapse. Each small action felt pointless, but I did it anyway. Not because it mattered, but because I needed something that didn't collapse when I touched it. There was no motivation. There was no passion. There was only discipline. Quiet, mechanical, unemotional, and slowly, something began to return. Not confidence, not excitement. Control. Control was subtle at first. It didn't announce itself. It showed up quietly, in small decisions that didn't feel heroic at all. Making the bed, eating something simple. Opening the window instead of closing the curtains. None of it fixed my life. None of it solved the bigger problems waiting outside those four walls. But it stopped the freefall, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I began to understand something uncomfortable. I couldn't trust my feelings anymore. My emotions had been hijacked by exhaustion and disappointment. If I waited to feel ready, to feel hopeful, to feel motivated, I would stay exactly where I was. So I stopped negotiating with how I felt. I treated my days like contracts, not conversations. You wake up, you move, you do the next small thing, whether you feel like it or not. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings when the old weight returned, pressing against my chest the moment I opened my eyes. The doubts were still there, waiting patiently. They hadn't disappeared. They had just learned to whisper instead of scream. They reminded me of everything I'd lost, everything that still wasn't fixed. On those days, discipline felt less like strength and more like stubborn survival. But survival was still progress. I started walking at night when the city was quiet and forgiving. No destination, no headphones, just movement. The rhythm of my steps became a kind of meditation, a reminder that my body still worked, that I could still move forward even when my mind resisted. I noticed things I hadn't seen in months, the way streetlights reflected on wet pavement, the sound of distant traffic, the simple fact that the world hadn't ended just because my plans had. Life was still happening. I had just stepped out of it for a while. Slowly, my energy returned. Not in arrows, not all at once. It came in fragments. I could focus a little longer. Sleep came a little easier. Food started to taste like something again. I began tackling the things I had been avoiding. Emails I hadn't answered, bills I hadn't opened, responsibilities I had buried under fear. Each task felt heavier before I started and lighter once it was done. That pattern became familiar. Fear was loud before action and silent after it. The most difficult part wasn't rebuilding my routine. It was rebuilding my identity. For so long, I had defined myself by what I was building, by how successful I appeared, by how much momentum I had. When that collapsed, I collapsed with it. Now I had to learn to exist without applause, without validation, without a clear finish line. I had to become someone who could stand on his own, even when nothing external was working. There were setbacks, days when I slipped back into old habits, nights when the doubt returned full force and sleep refused to come. But the difference now was this. I didn't interpret setbacks as proof that I was broken. I saw them as part of the process. Falling didn't erase the ground I'd already covered. It just meant I had to stand up again. Weeks passed, then months. The apartment no longer felt like a tomb. It felt lived in again. The whiteboards came back, not filled with grand visions, but with small, practical goals. Things that could be done today. Things that didn't depend on luck or timing or external approval. Just effort. I didn't become fearless. I didn't become endlessly confident. What I became was grounded. I trusted myself again, not because I believed everything would work out, but because I knew I would handle it if it didn't. That was the real transformation. Not success, not recovery. Self-respect. Looking back, I understand something now that I couldn't see then. Rock bottom wasn't the end of my story. It was the place where illusions burned away, where shortcuts stopped working, where excuses ran out. What remained was something quieter, stronger, and far more reliable. I didn't rise overnight. I rebuilt myself one ordinary day at a time. And that quiet discipline, the kind no one claps for, became the foundation for everything that came next. If you're in that dark place now, staring at a ceiling at 3 in the morning, wondering how you ended up here, hear this. The story isn't over. Not because things magically improve, but because you're still, and as long as you're here, there is work you can do. One step, one rule, one day at a time. That's how you come back.